People who know little about socialist realism, a group of people to which by the end of this video you will belong no longer, would probably tell you that socialist realism is an embarrassing relic of a totalitarian state. That it was an art movement artificially cooked up in bureaucratic offices of Communist Party officials and then forcefully pushed down the throats of artists who had no other choice but to comply with state's necessity for propaganda making. They would probably also point out that socialist realism broke all ties with modern painting and left no room for experimentation, self-expression, and flights of imagination. That's not entirely true. But you can see why someone would think that. All you need to do is compare artworks made in Europe and in post-revolutionary Russia at around the same time. If you do that, you might think that while the artists in the West experimented with form and content, plunging into daring experiments, artists in post-revolutionary Russia painted realistic, stern, and gray compositions. When artists in the West worked on articulating their own unique styles, artists in post-revolutionary Russia sacrificed their individual tastes to fit into the state narrative. And most importantly and excruciatingly, artists in the West seem to be free to continue with the long-standing traditions of modernist painting, whereas Soviet artists turned to realism, doing away with any potential formal experiments. But things are a little more interesting than that. And in this video, I will walk you through the historical context from which socialist realism emerged and offer for your consideration 3 most provocative and influential readings of what socialist realism really was and how it worked. Because at the end of the day, socialist realism was a twisted, historically entangled art movement that far exceeded the bounds of propaganda as category. It made deep and serious claims about the nature of truth in totalitarian society, about ideology as potential site for artistic innovation, and, most daringly, about art's will to power. Okay, so the cool thing about socialist realism is, as an art movement, it has a formula. It has a definition that clearly states what this art is meant to do. And I will share it with you at the end of this segment, but I worry that if I give it to you now, it might blind you to the aesthetic qualities of these works, which, whether we like it or not, they do possess. So why don't we start by looking at some of the artworks that belong to the socialist realist tradition? What is the feeling of these works of art? One thing that I always think about when looking at socialist realist art is that if a socialist realist painting had a sound, it would sound like an applause. There's always something eruptive and celebratory about these works. Although sometimes the uniformity of expressions and evenness of sunlight might make one uneasy, but these realist canvases communicate a sense of wholeness. Crowds are often present in coherent, productive masses. They always seem to be united in both motion, which is usually forward and up, and emotion, which is joy and concentration. The figures on these canvases are saturated with potential, both currently unraveling before our eyes and about to be met. Their bodies full of resolve and nascent energy. When I look at these figures, I often feel as if they're just about to breathe out. They're at the height of breathing in. These figures meet us head-on, equally committed to a single project. And even in its most somber compositions, you can sense a feeling of something big coming, the potential of great change lurking around in the shadows of Lenin's armchair, or the invisible horizon where Stalin has directed his gaze. But where does that feeling, where does that energy stem from? And this is where we need to turn to history. I will pick up where I left off in the Avant-Garde video in 1917, where Bolsheviks take over the power in a coup, pushing moderate socialists and liberal Democrats aside. The Romanovs, the monarchs, are arrested and relocated to Yekaterinburg, where they remain under house arrest until 1918, the year of their execution. Post-revolutionary years are marked by civil war, political unrest, and devastating famine. And as I mentioned in the Avant-Garde video, Bolsheviks didn't have a blueprint on how to do this communist thing with a territory that was still of imperial grandeur. Desperate attempts to nationalize agriculture results in famines and millions of deaths. In 1921, Vladimir Lenin introduces the new economic policy, or NEP, which for a short while injects small-scale capitalism into would-be socialist system, which helps the state to recover economically slightly, but of course makes a lot of problems for the party ideologically, right? If we're building a socialist state, small-scale capitalism is not really something we can stomach. During the new economic policy, two important things happen. In 1922, Joseph Stalin becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party, and 2 years later, 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies. While new economic policy proved to be successful short-term, Stalin and his allies wanted to return to a more centralized, planned economy to build socialism. And so in an attempt to do so, they proposed what is called 5-year plans, which are strategies for rapid industrialization and essentially salvaging of Soviet economy to protect it from exterior threats and interior instabilities. Both 5-year plans focused on heavy industries like machinery, coal, steel, and were marked once again by collectivization of agriculture. And while the industrial output grew throughout the 5-year plans, the social cost was catastrophic. This historical context is important for our purposes because it is against the backdrop of the second 5-year plan that socialist realism comes to the fore and is being established officially as the artistic movement to take Soviet Union into a bright, industrially developed socialist future. So 2 years after the announcement of the second 5-year plan, in 1934, the first Congress of Soviet writers takes place in Moscow. It was convened in order to unite Soviet writers and artists under a single ideological and aesthetic program that could serve the goals of socialist state building during the time of rapid industrialization and political consolidation. Essentially, the Congress aimed to solve the problem of artistic fragmentation. If you remember in the Avant-Garde video, we talked about all these different isms that emerge under the banner of new art, right? This new avant-garde art. The Congress wanted to make one decision and choose one lane onto which the artists were to step and move forward. So it sought to replace the formal experimental diversity of the 1920s with a clear, state-approved vision of art that could inspire and educate and mobilize. And so, apart from general political consensus, a formula was coined to define what is a socialist realist work of art. I promised you a formula, here's your formula. A socialist realist work of art is a truthful and historically specific representation of reality in its revolutionary development. That's it. Truthful, historically specific representation of reality in its revolutionary development. Say that 5 times faster. Truthful, historically specific representation of reality in its revolutionary development. No. What could that possibly mean, really? How do you follow it as an artist? Let's dissect it real quick. So the first half of the formula sounds like it's asking for documentation. It's asking to be truthful, meaning accurate, and historically specific, meaning current. So is socialist realism asking us for documentation, like documentary photography or film? The second part of the formula makes it a little bit weirder. What does it mean to represent reality in its revolutionary development? It gives socialist realism a kind of future-bound trajectory. And so it asks socialist realist art to represent reality according to the end goal of the revolutionary project. So, for example, look at this painting, The New Tractor from 1937. We have happy peasants celebrating the tractor that their village has just received. They're walking away from puddles and dirt road onto a beautifully sunlit road that the tractor is going to take them to, right? The sort of bright future. And so if you were to ask of this painting to be a truthful and historically specific representation of reality, it would fail. Because 1930s in the Soviet Union is a time of immense economic devastation. Famines, repressions, millions of deaths. But a socialist realist work of art would never depict a hungry peasant because in the future, he will be fed. A socialist realist work of art would never depict a devastated village because in the future it will be industrially advanced and flourishing. So it is projecting a reality that the party sees as inevitable. And you can say that this is just all an attempt to have artists misrepresent reality and push out sunny paintings of peasants while in reality they are starving to death. But the formulation itself is a little more sinister. This is not just about lying to people, this is about thwarting the nature of truth and orienting it towards a certain political and economic goal. Another interesting thing about the formulation of socialist realism as a truthful, historically specific representation of reality in its revolutionary development is that socialist realism has to be a representative art. And it is important and interesting for us because you and I know a little bit about Russian avant-garde and its decisive efforts to move away from representation. So you will remember, for example, something like a Lissitzky poster that uses abstract geometry to communicate a political idea. Compare that with a socialist realist work of art, right? They're so different. They are dedicated to the same project. It's just that different forms are being assigned to it. These formal differences are also politically important because they seemingly distance the utopian dreams of the early Russian avant-garde from the repressive state of Joseph Stalin that is established just a few decades after avant-garde is wiped away and replaced with socialist realism. However, there is an argument to be made that socialist realism and the Stalinist state as its paradigm was not at all radically different from the Russian avant-garde and the utopian dreams of early socialists as its paradigm. One scholar has argued in a very scandalous book that socialist realism and the Stalinist state was a logical continuation of the avant-garde and the utopian dreams about socialism. It comes out in 1991 or 92. I should have checked. Why didn't I check? I made a note for myself and didn't check anyway. Okay. I'm only human, what do you want? But in that book, Groys proposes to see the Soviet project as a total work of art and Stalin as its creator. And what is more and ever more scandalous, he argues that Stalin is a direct inheritor of the avant-garde project. That's like a very punk rock thing to say. But this is his argument. Listen to this. Groys writes, "Under Stalin, the dream of the avant-garde was in fact fulfilled, and the life of society was organized in monolithic artistic forms, though, of course, not those that the avant-garde itself had favored." So what Groys does in this book is essentially challenges the established and intuitive reading of movement from avant-garde to socialist realism as a rupture and as a radical break. Instead, he says that there is a continuity between the two movements. And we are invited to consider, are there similarities between the artistic ambition to restructure life via artistic form and the total reorganization of life via labor camps and the KGB? And while the intuitive answer can be no, Groys nonetheless stresses that the ambition, emotion, and drive that propelled both avant-garde art making and Stalin's state building, with socialist realism as its aesthetic, are more similar than they are different. What you are invited to consider is the possibility of an artist becoming a dictator. And if you remember our avant-garde conversation, you can kind of almost come around to this idea because we saw all these artists claiming that there are constructors, that they are here to rebuild and reformulate, reorganize material life. And Groys says, well, yeah, exactly. He writes, "It is precisely in this new avant-garde function of constructor of the new world that the artist is succeeded by a military and political leader ruling over the whole of reality saturated with art. The mystical figure of that great corporal of the guard, soon to be incarnated in the very real figure of Stalin." Okay, but hold up a second. So are you saying that if Malevich had his way, he would essentially become Stalin? Are we putting an equal sign between these two figures? No, not really. What we're looking at, Groys says, is the fruits of their labor. This aesthetic dictatorship of the avant-garde, Groys says, is echoed in the actual dictatorship of the Stalinist state. But what he also says is that for this transition, for this continuity to be possible, avant-garde as a project had to fail politically. This is what Groys writes. Although it is with rare exceptions expressed in ethical and political terms, the highest goal in the building of socialism is thus aesthetic, and socialism itself is regarded as the supreme means of beauty. Before this culture could be regarded from a truly aesthetic perspective, it had to fail to become a thing of the past. So Groys invites us to consider avant-garde's failed utopia as a prerequisite for Stalinist terror. And he does that, I'll repeat, by highlighting the fact that both socialist realism and the avant-garde were anti-representational, right? Avant-garde rejected representation altogether by turning to abstraction and geometry, and socialist realism represented truth, but in this revolutionary development, right? So again, it wasn't really representing reality. What Groys says both art movements did was project a new reality into life. It's just socialist realism was much better at doing that because it had Stalin on its side. And so in his reading, the avant-garde ambition to transform life flows seamlessly into the prescriptive vision of socialist realism. Let me know down below what you think about this thesis, because on the level of ideas, it works beautifully. It makes a splash, and I cannot stress enough just how influential this thesis is in the field of Slavic studies. People quote it and misquote it, argue with it, and support its claim. It's a really, really big deal. But again, if you are talking about art, it helps to look at art before you make a claim about it. And Groys does little of that. He works more on the level of ideas. But if we do the careful work of looking, the forms of both socialist realism and avant-garde will tell us a slightly different story. So, Groys's work is helpful in thinking about socialist realism because it asks crucial questions about art's relationship to reality, ideology, and ultimately the impact it has on life. In other words, the case of socialist realism seems to help us ask the question, do the artistic forms a given ideology takes matter? Does it make a difference if one turns to geometric abstraction or realist painting? If both works strive to contribute to the same ideological goal? In other words, do forms matter? In her book, The Wonderlands of the Avant-Garde, Professor Julia Vaingurt focuses on early avant-garde artists and poets and challenges Groys's idea of art's instrumentality, right? The idea that art can be instrumentalized by the state to be used as tool for its artistic purposes. She says that avant-garde was a little bit more interesting than that. This is what she writes. Groys's judgment of the avant-garde is not, as it were, total. He acknowledges that the avant-garde's declared project was fraught with contradictions, preventing its realization, and that Stalin's regime was the more successful towards this end for its having removed these contradictions. However, in his attempt to mold certain affinities between the avant-garde and Stalinism, cultural phenomena indeed shared insofar as they were glaring products of modernity. Into a continuous aesthetic paradigm, Groys argues that even the irrational, non-functional side of the avant-garde, its mysticism, so to speak, has its corollary in Stalinism, which was irrational and unproductive in its own right. And so the book is looking at how the avant-garde artists engaged with this dream to industrialize by turning to technology and industrial materials to make their artworks. Specifically, she looks at Vladimir Tatlin, among others, as an example of this imaginative play that walks the line between usefulness and complete absurdity. Here are just few examples of Tatlin's work that illustrate this point. The Monument to the Third International was Tatlin's 1919-1920 design for a towering, spiraling headquarters of the Communist International, conceived as a symbolic fusion of art and revolutionary technology that was never meant to be built, really, at full scale because its radical engineering and materials were intended as a visionary model rather than a practical architectural project. So Tatlin makes this model and says, imagine this, right? Imagine this, this is my work of art. I'm trying to stretch your capacity for imagination. Or here's another one of Tatlin's machines, is Le Tatlin, which was a late 1920s design for a human-powered flying machine intended as a poetic fusion of art, technology, and human aspiration. And it was never meant to be a practical aircraft, but rather a utopian sculptural experiment in the spirit of the Russian avant-garde. And even though, like in the previous video, we talked about avant-garde being a military metaphor that forgets that it's a metaphor, Vaingurt says, even if it forgets that it's a metaphor, it is still a metaphor. And she says that we can see that sort of metaphorical thinking, artistic play in the forms of the avant-garde, their abstraction, their imperfection, their madeness. She writes that metaphor destabilizes, as opposed to a symbol that stabilizes. Socialist realism, Vaingurt writes, sought the latter. So essentially, Vaingurt argues that a metaphor keeps meaning open. Even if it projects reality onto a real life, it projects a reality with a wrinkle in it. It keeps all the seams visible, as opposed to a symbol that projects a smooth narrative that delivers a fixed prescriptive answer. The avant-garde and its metaphors, Vaingurt says, kept meaning open and was asking questions rather than prescribing answers. And so the monument to the Third International that never ended up being built, or a flying machine that never took off the ground, or the radical geometric abstraction that never really secured its place as the guiding formal language for propaganda, those are not failed utopian projects. There are artistic failures, not political failures. And an artistic failure, Vaingurt also points out, is a necessary way for artists to push our imagination forward, to challenge our perceived understanding of reality. And that's essentially what art does. It works not as a tool, but as a metaphor. And as such, they stretch our understanding of the real. If Vaingurt writes about the imaginative leaps of the 1920s, Professor Christina examines the bodily ground of early socialist realist painting. In her most recent book, The Collective Body, Kehr considers the case of socialist realist painter Aleksandr Deineka, who was celebrated both abroad and in the Soviet Union, and offers a different kind of challenge to Groys's reading of socialist realism. Specifically, where Groys sees socialist realism as a top-down imposition of an aesthetic dogma, Kehr sees a lateral force field, a network of artists, groups, and institutions negotiating socialist realist meaning in real time. This is what Kehr writes. The broader art historical and museum world perception of Soviet art still remains largely enthralled to Boris Groys's seductive notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin, the total art of Stalin, according to which all Soviet artists made their dreams conform to that of Stalin. A history of a talented individual actor, such as Aleksandr Deineka in this case, purposefully working within rather than against nascent socialist realist system, helps to demonstrate that it was a system at least partially created and sustained by artists themselves, and certainly not, as in the totalitarian imaginary, by Stalin alone. Kehr proposes we take the political positions of these artists seriously. So Kehr challenges the idea that socialist realism was a total, abrupt, formal break from the Russian avant-garde. Instead, she shows how Deineka's figures remain ambiguous, expressive, at times resisting our reading, and remaining in the realm of experiment. Deineka, Kehr suggests, emerged from Soviet modernism, mixing avant-garde formal language with accessible figuration. His textile workers, for example, brims with geometric rhythms and modernist clarity. Yet it is also rooted in everyday Soviet life. Groys's framework might call this a continuation of the avant-garde's projection, but Kehr highlights that the work's texture and affect cannot be reduced to ideology alone. Compare the textile workers, for example, to Brodsky's Lenin and Smolny. Here you can really see the difference between Brodsky's fixed symbol and Deineka's layered ambiguity, which is exactly what Groys's idea can't quite account for. One of Kehr's central ideas is this idea of the collective body, a visual strategy where individual figures become part of a shared political organism, fluid, productive, gendered, but not entirely legible. Keir also emphasizes sensuality in Deineka's work. The flesh, the posture, and gesture of Deineka's workers are full of tension between control and freedom, visibility and disappearance. Keir sees socialist realism as a field within which artists still have the ability to ask questions and not only prescribe answers. And through careful formal analysis of these works, she shows precisely that. What I hope both Vaingurt and Keir's examples demonstrate is that artworks very often run against the smooth current of ideologies. We only need to know how to look. The question of art's will to power is an exciting one. Very often the idea of power shines so bright that it blinds us to the forms that the idea actually takes. In this video, you've seen artworks that have been made during some of the bloodiest years in the Soviet history. Pre-revolutionary unrest, civil war, famine, and contra-revolutionary purges. How does art behave under such conditions? If we just listen to what the artists say that they're doing, or to what the government says the artists are doing, we no longer have to do the work of looking ourselves. Someone else has already done that work for us. We no longer have to grapple with art's visual language, with the difficulty of its forms, with the subtleties of its tone. And if we take artworks to be mere illustrations to the pages of history, just tags on the historical timeline, we might remain blind to art's most extraordinary ability. Its ability to destabilize smooth ideological narratives. Its ability to locate and highlight moments that bring light into the darkest of times. Its ability to celebrate, in spite of it all, things that make us human. Our predisposition to doubt, our propensity to play, and our unceasing desire to dream.